Good morning. I hope you all are doing well and enjoying our journey together on qualitative research methodologies. In our previous videos, we talked about grounded theory, case study. Today, we will talk about narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry is an interesting methodology because it uses human stories to understand how people construct reality and how people process their experiences through stories. So we'll go in detail about this methodology. But before we do that, I want to talk about narrative psychology. And the reason is narrative psychology is kind of the root from where this method has emerged. So we'll spend some time on narrative psychology and understand some key tenets of narrative psychology, and then we'll come back to the methodology part of narrative inquiry. So let's start with narrative psychology. What is narrative psychology? It's a branch of psychology that studies human stories and explore what is the function of human stories, why as humans we tell stories, what is the purpose of telling a story. And this branch also explains how we humans construct and tell our stories. What are the goals that we achieve through our stories? So narrative psychology, in summary, does a systematic study, exploration of human stories and how these stories shapes human identity and other aspects of their day-to-day life. So narrative psychology has certain tenets that I think is very important for us as qualitative researchers to know. So let's begin with each of those tenets and understand them in detail. According to narrative psychology, we humans are storytellers. We humans tell stories. If you go in history, like in Stone Age, thousands of years ago, when humans were living in jungles and caves, there are huge evidence which suggest that those people, they did inscriptions on the cave walls, they made pictures, and those pictures were sort of there. They created those pictures to tell some stories related to the life that they were living those days. Even before we invented written language, there were evidence that suggests that we use stories to communicate. We use stories to tell other people about our values. So storytelling tradition is a very ancient tradition which is found in almost all human civilizations, ancient human civilizations that we know of. So storytelling is part of being a human. But the question is, why do we tell stories? What is the function of telling a story? So number one reason why people tell story is stories help us to make sense and meanings in our life. Think about the stories that we see around us, our own individual story or the stories that people tell us. These stories help us to make sense of what is happening within us and how to make sense of, how to get meaning of what is happening around us. So stories give us an opportunity. In fact, stories are tools that we humans use to organize our experiences in the sense of timeline, to organize how to make sense of what is happening here. So humans, we use a story as a tool to find meanings in what is happening within us and outside of us, and use that to form our agency and identity. What that means? Our identities or our sense of agency, who we are, is shaped by the stories that we are exposed to or the stories that we tell others and ourselves. So think about your own identity as a human. I take my example. So when I say I'm an Indian American, so what it means? Where this piece of identity comes from. If I say I am an intelligent person, so this identity, this part of my identity where I think I am very smart or intelligent, where does it come from? It comes from the stories that I have been exposed to and the stories that I am telling myself. So maybe when I was in school, my teachers told me, like, Rakesh, you are a very smart student. Maybe I got this feedback consistently from people around me, and then these stories that people are telling me that I'm smart or intelligent becomes gradually part of my identity, and I think now that I'm intelligent. And the other way around too, if somebody says that I'm a bad person, now where does it come from? It comes from my interaction with the people around me and the feedback, the stories that people are telling me about myself, and after some time I incorporate those stories as part of my identity and I tell myself I'm a bad person. So you see, our development over the years, our sense of identity, our sense of who we are is shaped by the stories that we are exposed to and also the stories that we have been telling ourselves. The story has a purpose. Number one is it helps us make sense of what is happening within us, outside of us. It gives us find meanings in what is happening around us. And also it gives us, shapes our identity, our agency. Another key purpose of function of telling a story is transferring knowledge or communicating with others. So narrative psychology says that we can know a lot about a person's values, ethics, their strengths, their weaknesses, based on the stories that they tell. So if you analyze the stories of people they have been sharing, you can know a lot about the person. And in history, when language was not invented, language was there, but it was more sort of oral rather than written language. In those days, every community, they share stories to the younger generation. And these stories were constructed based on what I want my younger generation to learn, to value, and what is good for them. So in a way, stories becomes, in oral traditions, these are the tools to transfer, to communicate the learnings, the values, beliefs, assumptions to the next generation. So values are very, very important. Stories are important tool for transferring, communicating with people around us. I remember when I was growing up, I was exposed to stories in my family about some older, my grandmother. And those stories in some way shaped my personality or the values that I carry uh, in my own day-to-day life and functioning. So stories are a way to transfer knowledge to people around us. So these are the three key functions of why we tell stories, or the functions of telling stories. Now, some more principles of storytelling. Stories are not stagnant entities, they evolve over time. So, stories are not stagnant. In fact, some scholars argue that stories are like a living organism. And like a living organism, it evolves and changes with passage of time. So, for example, if I ask, let's say, a newlywed couple about, if I tell them, tell me the story of your marriage, and let's say this couple has married 6 months ago. Now, if I ask the same couple, let's say 5 years down the line after marriage, and same question, tell me the story of your marriage. And let's say if I ask the same couple, maybe 20 years down the line, same questions, tell me the story of your marriage. Do you think all these three stories are going to be the same? No. These stories will not be the same. Why? Because stories evolve with passage of time based on our human experiences. So the couple in example, they will tell the story based on their 6 months being in the marriage. The other story will be based on their experiences 5 years in that marriage, and the third story will be like 20 years in the marriage. So stories change, evolve. It has its own, it's like a living organism that keep on evolving. So stories are not stagnant, and they change and evolve with passage of time. Another very important concept that we comes from narrative psychology is stories are interconnected. And since they are interconnected, they influence each other. So think about, you may heard about neurons, like our brain cells. Neurons looks like this. And the nuclei, and then at the outside you have these dendrites, and that connect to other neurons outside. So that's how neurons are located. And they are connected with each other. They communicate with each other. Similarly, stories are also the same. So an individual story is not sort of a separate entity. It is connected with other stories around that. What it means that, let's say if I say this is individual story, the individual story is connected with family stories. And the family stories in turn are connected with community stories, or the community where we grow up. And the community stories are further connected with broader socio-economic and political stories. And these stories, they interconnect, they sort of influence each other. They interact with each other and influence and shape each other. So, so these stories are like a web, and they sort of influence and interact with each other and shape each other. So I give you an example. We were doing a study on elder financial abuse by their power of attorney, who in most cases are children of these elders. And we were interviewing these children about uh, their experience, because there was some financial abuse going on by the power of attorney, by their children, and then other family members sort of identify and then sort of reported. And so while we were interviewing, a theme emerged, which was like how these elders, money related behaviors are influenced by the time they grew up. So most of these elders, they grew up in 1930s, 1920s, and 1940s. And all of them, their behavior, how they look at money, was influenced by the Great Depression of 1930s, when people were losing jobs, financial institutions broke down, and these people who were young at that time, when later in their life, they have a hard time trusting the banks or other financial institutions. They would prefer to keep money, cash in their home rather than in banks. And it was interesting to see how these individual stories that we were exploring and talking and collecting these stories from these people, how these individual stories of these people is connected with the economic stories, broader economic story of 1930s. So again, coming back to the idea that our individual stories are not separate, they are interconnected, just like the mirror neurons influencing each other. Individual stories are situated under the family stories influence our individual stories, and then the community that grow up in, that also influence our outlook, our personality, our thinking pattern, and then broader socio-economic political stories influence these individual stories. So stories are not stagnant, and stories are interconnected web that influence each other. So that's briefly about some of the key concepts related to narrative psychology. So now let's switch gears and talk about narrative inquiry as a research design. While I'll discuss about narrative inquiry as a research methodology, I want you to keep in mind these ideas, these concepts, these tenets that we learned from narrative psychology. And that was the whole idea why I wanted to share these before jumping into the methodological piece of narrative inquiry. So, what does a narrative inquirer, a person who is using this narrative inquiry as a methodology, what do they do? And how this method is different from other approaches such as phenomenology or grounded theory. Narrative inquirers or researchers, they focus on stories and experiences of people based on the research topic they are exploring. So let's say if I did one study on narrative inquiry where I was interested in understanding people who have near-death experiences, and I was interested to see how these near-death experiences change their life later on. So, as part of my research, I was collecting stories from the people who have gone through such experiences, who have had near death experiences where somebody may be like in a major car accident where they were like hospitalized for 6 months, almost died, but they came back. And so we were collecting stories from people who have near death experiences. So, as the focus of a narrative inquirer is to collect stories and experiences of the people, and how those stories shapes realities, uh, realities and experiences. So, how the stories they are telling me is shaping the way they understand reality, the way they process the meanings. So, a narrative researcher focuses on experiences and collecting stories from people to understand the meanings, the realities that is being shaped by those stories. So, focus is always a person's personal stories and experiences. Narrative inquirers, let's talk briefly about the philosophical roots of narrative inquiry. Constructivism and storytelling are two important roots that philosophies that has shaped narrative inquiry as a methodology. And we already talked a lot about those tenets from narrative psychology, so I won't go there again. So that's for you to understand that philosophical roots of narrative inquiry is constructivism and storytelling. Constructivism, because if you remember, we talked about this philosophy of research, constructivism, which suggests, which argue that our social reality are socially constructed based on our interaction with the people around us, with the environment around us, our social realities emerge. And since storytelling is kind of a tool that helps in that process of creating social reality, and that's the reason why I put both constructivism and storytelling. So these two are the philosophical roots of uh, narrative inquiry. Now let's talk about data collection process, data collection and data analysis. So in data collection, obviously the focus is on collecting stories from people. So you can do that through interviews, and the interviews in narrative inquiry is pretty in-depth. You do first interview where collect stories, you and then you meet again to further ask further questions to gain more insight about the stories that the participants are sharing with you. So stories, sometime researcher also collect artifacts which are sort of associated with some stories that they are sharing. So artifacts, interviews, documents can also be a source of data for narrative inquirer, which is sort of related to the phenomenon that we are investigating. Data analysis is interesting here. For data analysis, narrative inquiry, we use, we call it narrative analysis actually. In narrative analysis, what we do is like we first collect the stories of the people related to the phenomenon that I am interested in, and then we organize these stories timeline wise, and then we focus on how these stories are connected with other stories across participants. So let's say this is individual story, and then uh, family, community stories, and then broader socio-economic, political stories. And then we compare and contrast the stories of other participants, and we sort of compare these stories between participants, within participants, and see what are some resonant threads. What are some resonant threads that connect these stories from one individual to another individual? And that resonant thread becomes kind of a theme that emerges out of the data. So instead of calling that as a theme, as you remember in other approaches, we did thematic analysis. But here, we do not call that as a theme. We say that resonant threads. The threads are these threads which connect the stories across participants, and that becomes kind of our resonant thread or themes for the study. So this is briefly about narrative inquiry. I don't want to go into a lot of details. We will go later in those details in terms of stepwise process of data collection. But right now, overall, what I want you all to know a bit of roots of narrative inquiry, how it is influenced by narrative psychology, about the storytelling process and how stories shapes our life, and then focusing on how we use these learnings from narrative psychology in this methodology, which is narrative inquiry. In summary, narrative inquiry is a qualitative methodology which uses, which focuses on collecting people's stories and analyzing those stories to understand how those stories are shaping people's lives, people's identity, people's outlook towards themselves as well as others, or in relation to the phenomenon that we are investigating as a researcher. So that's briefly about narrative inquiry. I hope it clarifies the concept, and I'll see you again in another video. Till then, thank you. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.